Good Friday, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for July the 7th. Today, we are reading together in Judges chapter 14 and Judges chapter 15, which is going to get the middle section of the saga of Samson. We read yesterday about the promise of his birth from the angel of Yahweh, the pre-incarnate Christ, delivering this message to Manoah and Mrs. Manoah primarily. And we see at the end of chapter 13 and verse 24 that the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. The boy grew and Yahweh blessed him. And then the spirit of Yahweh began to stir him in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So we need to recognize the time frame in which this is taking place, that right now, during this time in Israel, in chapter 13, verse 1, Israel is being oppressed by the Philistines, and that has been the case for 40 years. We're going to end up seeing in chapter 15 that Israel seems pretty content with this. They are just allowing the Philistines to rule over them, and they have a kind of a, I don't know, I don't think symbiotic's the right word for it, but they just have an understanding that, yes, you're going to rule over us, and we'll respect that, and we'll just kind of go along with it. But here we see at the end of chapter 13, Yahweh wants to stir that up. And that's what I want to focus in on in our reading, is what Yahweh is doing. Because I want to preach on Sunday through the Samson saga. I want to preach through it and look at it from the different angle of what caused Samson to fail so often, what led to his downfall. We'll talk about that on Sunday. So for the reading today, I want to focus on Yahweh and what Yahweh is looking to accomplish through Samson and through the mistakes that he makes, and just to show that God wants his people to recognize that you're not to be ruled by anybody but me. I am the one under whom you should submit, not the Philistines. We'll see how Yahweh works that out through the story of Samson. So let me get the text up on the screen for us of chapter 14 and 15 here of Judges. And then we'll have a few comments again. I want you to focus in on, if you can, focus in on what Yahweh is doing throughout this text. Judges chapter 14, verse number 1. Judges 14, verse number 1, Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back and told his father and his mother, I have seen a young woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. But his father and mother said to him, can't you find a young woman among our relatives or among any of our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? But Samson told his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Now his father and mother did not know this was from Yahweh, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for a confrontation. And at that time, the Philistines were ruling Israel. So that goes back to chapter 13 and verse number 1. Samson went down to Timnah and his father and mother, with his father and mother, and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring at him, and the spirit of Yahweh came powerfully on Samson. He tore the young lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Then he went and spoke to the woman, because she seemed right to Samson. After some time, when he returned to marry her, he left the road to see the lion's carcass, and there was a swarm of bees with honey in the carcass. He scooped some honey into his hands and ate it as he went along. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had scooped the honey from the lion's carcass. His father went to visit the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, as young men were accustomed to doing. When the Philistines saw him, they brought 30 men to accompany him. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. If you can explain it to me during the 7 days of the feast and figure it out, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't explain it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they replied. Let's hear it. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. After 3 days, they were unable to explain the riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, persuade your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's family to death. Did you invite us here to rob us? So Samson's wife came to him weeping and said, "You hate me and you don't love me. You told my people the riddle, but you haven't explained it to me." "Look," he said, I haven't even explained it to my father or mother. So why should I explain it to you?" She wept the whole 7 days of the feast. And at last, on the seventh day, he explained it to her because she had nagged him so much. Then she explained it to her people. And on the seventh day, before sunset, the men of the city said to him, "What is sweeter than honey? Or what is stronger than a lion?" So Samson said to them, "If you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle now." The Spirit of Yahweh came powerfully on him, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men. He stripped them and gave them clothes and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. In a rage, Samson returned to his father's house, and his wife was given to one of the men who had accompanied him. Chapter 15. Later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift and visited his wife. "I want to go to my wife in her room," he said, but her father would not let him enter. "I was sure you hated her," her father said, "so I gave her to one of the men who accompanied you. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she is? Why not take her instead?" Samson said to them, "This time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines." So he went out and caught 300 foxes. He took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, or jackals is another possibility here, because jackals were more common back then. They ran in packs, so it might be easier to understand this is jackals that he caught. This is a translation issue. But nonetheless, he turned the foxes or jackals tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. Then he ignited the torches and released them into the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned the piles of grain and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. Then the Philistines asked, "Who did this?" They were told it was Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because he took Samson's wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines went to her and her father and burned them to death. Then Samson told them, "Because you did this, I swear that I won't rest until I've taken vengeance on you." He tore them limb from limb, and then he went down and stayed in the cave at the rock of Etam. The Philistines went up, camped in Judah, and raided Lehi. So the men of Judah said, "Why have you attacked us?" They replied, "We have come to tie Samson up and pay him back for what he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the cave at the rock of Etam, and they asked Samson, "Don't you realize that the Philistines rule us? What have you done to us?" "I have done to them what they did to me," he answered. They said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Then Samson told them, "Swear to me that you yourselves won't kill me." "No," they said, "we won't kill you, but we will tie you up securely and hand you over to them." So they tied him up with 2 new ropes and led him away from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came to meet him shouting, and the Spirit of Yahweh came powerfully on him, and the ropes that were on his arms and wrists became like burnt flax and fell off. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, I piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men." When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone and named the place Jawbone Hill. He became very thirsty and called out to Yahweh, "You have accomplished this great victory through your servants. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split a hollow place in the grounds at Lehi, and water came out of it. After Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. This is why he named it Hakor Spring, which is still in Lehi today. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Judges chapters 14 and 15. All right, so let's think about this text again. I want to focus in our read on what Yahweh is working out throughout this story of Samson. Number one, again, going back, we recognize this is during the time whenever the Philistines are ruling Israel, and God doesn't want that. That's not supposed to be how things are to be done. It is Israel who is supposed to be ruling and displacing the pagans of the lands. The Philistines were a Hellenistic people. They came from the Mediterranean Sea and that land that was on that side of the Mediterranean Sea, and they were known as being very strong warriors. For the most part, they were just bigger. They were bigger sized individuals, and they fought with many different nations in various wars. So Israel sees them, and they become scared. And not only do they become scared, but Yahweh delivers them over to the Philistines because of the way they've rebelled against Yahweh. Or they rebelled against him. But it is Samson who Yahweh is going to use to upset the apple cart, to show this is not the way that you should be living. You should not be living under the oppression of someone else. It is the Spirit of Yahweh who began to stir him at the end of chapter 13. Well, in chapter 14, we read about Samson. Throughout his story, one thing to focus on is the fact that he's really very much led with his eyes. He is a very visually driven person. Whatever his eye sees, if he wants it, he tries to get it. And the first thing we see is about this woman. But his parents are like, no, you should be looking for someone within your own people. He's like, no, this is the woman I want. She is the woman. I think she's hot. She's the one I want. And they don't understand. They also don't understand that this is something that Yahweh is going to use. Yahweh is going to use this in order to provide an opportunity for a confrontation between his people and the Philistine people. Again, he wants to upset the comfortable way that they've settled in with one another, which is very much obvious once we get to chapter 15, where the men of Judah are very upset with Samson that he has messed up the relationship between them and the Philistines, Judah specifically, which is very interesting because going back to the beginning of the book, we see that it was Judah who was supposed to go up first to fight against the Canaanites and against the people of the land. Well, now we see them here. They've been completely emasculated. They have no courage whatsoever against the people of the land. And they're saying, hey, you don't need to mess this up for us because we're comfortable. We're happy with this arrangement. But Yahweh's not. And neither should they have been. So Yahweh is going to work through this. He's also going to come upon Samson and give him the strength. So probably the way we should understand Samson and envision him is not of some big bodybuilder like The Rock or somebody like that. More so, I would probably say Samson just a regular looking guy. But it is the Spirit of Yahweh that comes upon him and gives him the strength to be able to do these incredible things. He comes upon him and he tears this lion apart as if it's a young lamb, with the ease with which somebody might destroy something as helpless as a young lamb. That's what Samson does here with this lion that comes upon him. You might connect that with what we see in what we see in verse 14 and chapter 14, verse number 5. Suddenly a young lion came roaring at him. We go over to chapter 15 and verse number 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came to meet him shouting. So here we have two instances where there are two things, the lion in one hand, the Philistines in another hand, that are coming to destroy Samson. And yet it is the Spirit of Yahweh that allows him to be able to destroy both of these enemies, both the single lion and then the group of the Philistines as well. This is also seen in verse 19 of chapter 14, where the Spirit of Yahweh came powerfully on him after the riddle that he had presented before the Philistines who were at this wedding feast. Again, I'm going to give a lot more detail about this on Sunday, breaking down these stories a lot more, just focusing on Yahweh right now, that the Spirit of Yahweh comes powerfully upon him. And that's whenever he goes, what does he do? He causes more friction between the Israelites and the Philistines by going down to Ashkelon and killing 30 of those men and giving basically probably torn up and bloody clothes to these Philistines who he feels had wronged him. So after all this, so whether it be the incident with the lion, the Philistines with this Philistine woman that he wanted to marry, or whether it be the revenge that they try to get on Samson after he burned down their wheat, which we're talking about a major economic blow for the Philistines at that point. In all of these instances, Yahweh empowers Samson to stand up against the Philistines and to destroy them, really destroy them, as the Israelites should have done initially. So you might think in all this that Samson would give credit to Yahweh and say that Yahweh is the one who has done this. But what he says in verse 16 of chapter 15, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have piled them in heaps, or maybe a better way of understanding this is with the jawbone of a donkey, I have made donkeys out of them. So just like I found this dead donkey and I took its jawbone and beat them to death with it, so I have turned them into donkeys, just like that donkey is. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. Just Samson on his own? I thought it was Yahweh that empowered him. It was Yahweh that empowered him. But verse 18, he does call out to Yahweh. Maybe he's finally going to give thanks now. But no, instead, I believe he arrogantly and selfishly calls upon God. Calls out to Yahweh, you have accomplished this great victory through your servant. I think that is just pretense on Samson's part, because his real focus is on him. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And even with this, even with the way Samson is being very, very ungodly in this moment, very unfaithful, he's very much selfishly focused. God still splits a hollow place in the ground at Lahai, and water came from it. Samson here only calls on Yahweh for whenever he's in need of something. But again, Yahweh continues to work through him. Why? This is not about Samson. It's not primarily about Samson. It's about his people as a whole. And what's he wanting to do? He's wanting Israel to separate themselves from the Philistines. He's not wanting his people to be under the thumb of these uncircumcised people. He wants them to remember who they are and that they are supposed to be ruling over these people. Why? Because just as Yahweh is empowering Samson to gain victory over the Philistines, so would God empower them as a whole, as an entire nation, to have victory over the Philistines if they would simply trust in him. So that's really the story of Samson up to this point. Again, he's wanting to upset the apple cart. He's wanting to cause friction, cause a confrontation between his people who are content and are comfortable in this situation whenever they shouldn't be whatsoever. So that's what we see here within the story of Samson up to this point. We're going to see, obviously, the conclusion of the matter in chapter 16 tomorrow, as we read probably the most well-known portion of Samson's life, Samson and Delilah. We'll look at that and consider how God continues to work through Samson to bring about the defeat of the Philistine people. If you have any questions or comments about this text, please feel free to leave that in the comments section below. Love to have a discussion with you on whatever thoughts you might have, or answer any questions you might have as best I can. I appreciate so much you reading along with me today. We'll be back at it again tomorrow, and I hope you'll join me for that. I also want to wish a very happy anniversary. I believe today is Jeff and Stephanie's wedding anniversary. Very happy anniversary to them. Hope you all have a great day, and thank you for your great example of marriage. Hope you all have a great day. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care, and God bless.